Axel's Garage. On today's video, we are trying to diagnose a hum or a rub or some kind of rotational sound. When you drive the car and you get it up over 20 miles an hour or so, you hear this constant, sort of like a rubbing sound, like a like on those bad commercials. But you get this whine, this rubbing. It's sort of like you feel it in the steering wheel a little bit, like just a constant rotational vibration, I guess you could call it, and you hear it. It's not good enough to hear on camera. We went for a ride with the camera and that just didn't work out. So what we thought it was, it seemed like when you turn the wheel to the right a little bit and started making a sweeping right turn going above 20 miles an hour, the sound went away. So we thought that it was the wheel bearing on the passenger side. This was a year ago. And we replaced that wheel bearing, took it for a ride, didn't really hear the sound, thought it was fixed, but it wasn't because the sound was there. I guess it was just wishful thinking. And it progressively has gotten a little bit louder. And now when you turn it to the right, it doesn't really go away anymore. It kind of stays there now. So there's only a few things that really it could be in the front end. It could be your alignment way out of whack. We don't see that that's the issue because the truck drives pretty straight. The steering wheel's straight on center. Doesn't pull to one side or the other. It could be your front differential because who knows what's turning. The drive shaft is always turning. Who knows what's turning there. We changed the front diff fluid, made no difference to the sound. We checked our U-joints in our front drive shaft. They're tight. So we now, we replaced that one hub bearing on the passenger side, which was a waste, but at 150 or so thousand miles, they're probably on their way anyway. So now we're trying to, I drove it a bunch of times, my wife drove it a bunch of times, and we both, whether we're sitting in the driver's seat or the passenger seat, we both feel like it's coming from the driver's side. So now we're kind of fixated on the driver's front wheel. So on the driver's front wheel, you have your hub bearing and you have your axle shaft. Now which one is it? A hub bearing, depending on which ones you buy, $50 for a Chinese knockoff and about $120 for a good US made hub bearing. And then you got your axle shaft, and I didn't even price them out. But it could be one or the other, so how do you figure out which it is? Well, they say a good way to check the hub bearing is to jack the car up and see if you could move the wheel up or down or side to side and get any play in that hub bearing. And we did that, and there's no play. But they also say that doesn't mean that the hub bearing is good, because just because there's no play doesn't mean the bearing itself didn't go bad. It's just not giving play and it's making the noise. So I don't want to gamble on a hub bearing. It's cold out. We're back doing this in the cold. I'd really like to try to diagnose it. So my thought process behind it is to pull the axle shaft out and go for a ride with no front driver's side axle shaft and see if we still have the noise. If we still have the noise, then we know it's the hub bearing. If the noise went away, then we know it's the axle shaft. And I don't know if this is going to work or not. It's something that we're trying, and we'll see if we can diagnose it. So the first step is to take, there is a, the axle shaft retaining nut is right behind the center cap of your wheel. Got to get that off, and that's on there at 155 foot-pounds, so it's on there real tight. So the best way to loosen that up is with a long breaker bar or a good impact, and my impact ain't that good to break that nut free. But leave the vehicle down on the ground so that you got the tire on the ground and the tire won't turn on you. So I'm going to get the tools out, set the camera up, and we'll see what we can do. So with the truck on level ground, wheel straight, took the center cap off, 36 millimeter socket on this axle nut and a long breaker bar, and hopefully we can break it free. Okay, not too bad with a long breaker bar. Broke it loose, and now we'll take the impact and we'll buzz it the rest of the way off with the impact. What I did neglect to say, before you take it all the way off and you get it to the point where the nut is to the edge of the threaded shaft, what you want to do when it's here is grab a hammer and you want to give it a whack so that it pops in. And the reason why I did that is because that shaft coming through sometimes corrodes to the back of the hub bearing, and when you go to pull that axle shaft out, sometimes they're stuck. So give it a little tap here, and then we'll get the nut the rest of the way off, hopefully with the impact. helped in this situation. This is an '03 Suburban, 2000 to 2006. All the front ends are the same, whether it's a Suburban, a Yukon, a Tahoe, a pickup truck, anything like that. Next step is to jack the front of the truck up. We really only need this side up, so I'm going to jack it up, put a jack stand on the chassis rail, let the wheel hang, and then we'll move the camera on into the truck. Okay, so what I have is the truck jacked up and the jack stand on the chassis rail, but the front tire, you can see, is still making contact with the ground. So when we put it back down, we want that front tire on the ground so that it gives us resistance and the axle doesn't spin when we're trying to loosen up the bolts where the axle shaft bolts to the front differential. So right up here you have your, I believe it's 5 or 6 bolts that bolt your axle shaft to your front diff. Those have a 15 millimeter head on them. And they're, you know, they're in there snug, but it's not unmanageable. There is a torque spec on this, 60 foot-pounds. So that's what you're fighting against, that 60 foot-pounds and whatever corrosion is on them. So you should be able to break 3 of them before you have to jack the truck up a little bit, turn the tire to get the other 3. And that's what we're going to do now. So I jacked it up just enough to get the tire off the ground, spin the tire 180 degrees, and now you can get at the other 3 bolts. Alright, just using a little hammer to separate the axle shaft flange from the differential flange. They sort of rust together a little bit. Just give it a couple taps with a hammer and it separates the 2 halves. You can then slide the axle shaft down like that and try to wiggle it out of the wheel end. The hang up is the sway ball link, so I'm trying to jockey it through the sway ball link without disconnecting the sway ball link. And also the skid plate is giving me a little interference too. If I took the skid plate down or the sway ball link, this thing should come out pretty easy. I'm going to see if I could wrestle it out. Alright, we did get the axle out. We did not have to remove the sway ball link right here, which is the limiting factor, but these factory sway ball links don't really have a good nut on the top. They do on the bottom. They're not easy to come out. So with some creative jacking of the control arm up and down, turning the wheel really didn't help. It was more jacking the control arm up and down and just wiggling it out. It does come out. You can see, here's the flange. The flange is sealed so nothing's going to leak out. That'll just spin now. Or, yeah, well, no, it won't spin because it's not giving input. It might spin. But we now took that axle shaft out of the equation for the vibration on this vehicle. Let me get back out from under the car and I'll explain. Alright, so here's your axle shaft. Alright, the side that goes to the front diff is sealed as well. Here's your spline side that slides through the bearing. Alright, this turns whenever you're driving the car, and the reason why it turns is because it's splined going through that hub bearing, and the wheel is actually what's turning the shaft. The shaft isn't being driven by the center section unless you're in four-wheel drive. Now by taking this out, we eliminate this from a vibration or a sound or a hum, whatever it might be. I don't know if it's going to throw some codes now because the front diff, which is electronic, is not getting feedback from the wheel. I don't know. I don't care because I'm trying to diagnose whether this is bad or that from hub bearing is bad. Getting it out, right? It was a little bit of raising the control arm and the angle of the control arm to try to get it. This is the widest part, and this part here was getting stuck between the shock on one side and the sway bar link on the other side. The easiest way to get this out would be to take that sway bar link out. The problem with the sway bar link is that it's the factory sway bar links in there, and there's no nut on top. It's like a threaded metal plate that is difficult to grab. I guess you got to grab it with a pair of like vice grips or something. There might even be a special tool for it, but in order to get at it, you got to take the front tire off. So we gave it an extra 5 minutes of wiggling and jiggling, and we're able to get it out. Putting it back in, that sway bar link's going to have to come out. When I order either an axle or a hub bearing, I'll see how much the sway bar end links are. They're probably, you know, 15, 20 bucks, and I'll put a new set of end links in, because the rubbers on the factory end links that are in this truck are kind of crappy anyway. 150,000 miles, it's kind of beat up. And then it'll be easy to get those sway bar links in and out with a nut on top. You know, the big long bolt with a nut on top will be much easier, especially when we put a little white grease on it so it doesn't rust up closed on us. So right now, we're going to go for a drive. We're going to give it a good drive, get it up to speed, listen for that sound, and hopefully when I get pulled back into the driveway, we'll know whether it's the bearing or the axle that gave us the problem in the end. The axle at Axle's Garage. Hey. Alright, so after going for a ride, I got the car up to speed and the sound was still there. I confirmed the sound. It's a groan. That's the best way to describe it. It's just a groan, rotational groan, constant. It doesn't come and go with the rotation of the wheel. It's constant once you get over 20 miles an hour, and the faster you go, the louder it gets. And as I turned to the right, I gave it a little couple turns like this to the right, and the sound didn't completely go away, but it changed, got a little better and changed, and then back to the groan, changed. So I was able to change it by going to the right. And also when I went over like a swooping bump, I also got a change in the sound. It didn't go away, but it changed. So with the axle out, we know it's not the axle, the sound. Chances are it's the wheel bearing. Now remember, they say testing the wheel bearing, you know, you jack the car up, grab the wheel, give it a wiggle to the right and left, give it a wiggle to the top and the bottom, and if you have play that doesn't move the ball joint or the tie rod, it's your hub bearing, or your hub bearing, whichever you, wheel bearing, whichever you want to call it, the hub assembly. I didn't have any play. But when I came back in the driveway, I'm thinking about it, saying, you know what? When that axle is through, when the spline shaft is through the hub, and you got the nut on with that washer, it's kind of holding everything together. So I wonder if I'll see some play now that the axle is out. And I probably should have done this before I took the axle completely out. I think what you can do to help diagnose that hub bearing, grab the wheel, jack it up, grab the wheel, shake it from side to side, top to bottom. If you got play, you know your hub is bad. But if you don't have play, unbolt that axle nut, that 36mm axle nut, take that off, tap the shaft so that it's free and everything in there is loose before you take that axle out. And this is what you're going to find. Let me move the camera and show you what you're going to find, because now that we got that axle unbolted and ours is out, but if you just had yours unbolted and you gave that wiggle where you didn't have play before, look at the play that we have now. I'll show you. Move the camera. Alright, so here's our wheel. We're up off the ground on the floor jack. Right, the axle shaft is out, but yours could be just unbolted if you want to check for play. Grab the wheel from side to side. You can hear it. You can see it. Look at that play. You can hear it banging around. So that axle shaft being in here and bolted up is actually what was holding it together tight, and it didn't make it feel like it was loose. Once we undid that now, this wheel bearing or hub bearing or hub assembly is completely shot. So that's it. Correctly diagnosed the problem. Probably took more steps than we had to, but now we know, and now you know, if you first give it a jiggle and you think it's that hub assembly and you're shaking it and it's not moving or not giving you any play, unbolt that axle and then give it a shake and see what happens. Now we know we're going to replace that hub assembly and we should be good to go. Problem solved. Believe it or not, we don't have any shimmy in the wheel. There is no feel in the wheel with that loose hub for some reason. I guess when it gets worse, you start feeling it. That's it today from Axle's Garage. I hope you liked the video. If you did, give us that thumbs up. And if you like what we're doing here at Axle's Garage, please subscribe to our channel. And as always, thanks for watching.